Welcome. We discuss the following topic. Rules for sea and inland waterway transport. Obligations and risk in contracts for international sales. Identification of goods in carriage, Article 32. Conformity of the goods and third-party claims, Article 35. Rules for sea and inland waterway transport. Free on board, FOB, means that the seller delivers the goods on board the ship nominated by the buyer at the named port of shipment or procures the goods already so delivered. The risk of loss of or damage to the goods passes when the goods are on board the vessel, and the buyer bears all costs from that moment onwards. Free on board, FOB, means that the seller delivers the goods on board the ship nominated by the buyer at the named port of shipment or procures the goods already so delivered. The risk of loss of or damage to the goods passes when the goods are on board the vessel, and the buyer bears all costs from that moment onwards. Cost and freight, CFR, means that the seller delivers the goods on board the vessel, ship. The risk of loss of or damage to the goods passes when the goods are on board the vessel. The seller must contract for and pay the costs and freight necessary to bring the goods to the named port of destination. Cost, insurance and freight, CIF, seller clears the goods for export and delivers them when they are on board the vessel at the port of shipment. Seller bears the cost of freight and insurance to the named port of destination. Seller's insurance requirement is only for minimum cover. Buyer is responsible for all costs associated with unloading the goods at the named port of destination and clearing goods for import. Risk passes from seller to buyer once the goods are on board the vessel at the port of shipment. Obligations and risk in contracts for international sales. Obligation of the seller. Article 35, 1, state that, in general, the seller must deliver goods that are of the quantity, quality and description required by the contract and that are contained or packaged in the manner required by the contract. Delivery obligations. Article 30 states that the seller must deliver the goods, hand over any documents relating to them and transfer the property and the goods, as required by the contract and the United Nations Convention for the Contract on International Sale of Goods, UNSIGS. Place of delivery, Article 31. If the seller is not bound to deliver the goods at any other particular place, his obligation to deliver consists of following: a. If the contract of sale involves carriage of the goods, in handing the goods over to the first carrier for transmission to the buyer. B. If the parties are aware that goods would be in a particular place, then the seller discharges the obligation by placing the good at the buyer's disposal at that place. C. If the above situations do not apply, then the seller discharges his duty of delivery by placing the goods at the place where the seller had their business at the time contract was concluded. Identification of goods in carriage, Article 32. If the seller hands over the goods to the carrier and if the same are not identifiable, then the identification of goods can be done by markings on them and by the shipping documents. The mode of transportation of goods selected by the seller must be reasonable and in accordance with the usual terms. Insurance of goods, Article 32. If the seller is not bound to insure the goods, then he must at the buyer's request provide all the information to the buyer to enable him to insure the goods. Delivery time, Article 3.3. The seller must deliver the goods on the date fixed and determined by contract. If a date is to be determined from a period in the contract, then at any time within that period, or if it is to be determined by the buyer, then the date so determined by him. If no date or time is stated in contract, then within reasonable time. Handing over the documents, Article 34. Seller must hand over documents at the time and place as required in contract. If the documents have been handed over before time, then any correction may be made in documents, if necessary, before the required time, provided it does not cause the buyer unreasonable expense. Conformity of the goods and third-party claims, Article 35. The seller must deliver goods which are of the quantity, quality and description required by the contract and which are contained or packaged in the manner required by the contract. The goods do not conform with the contract unless they are fit for the purposes for which goods of the same description would ordinarily be used, or fit for any particular purpose expressly or impliedly made known to the seller at the time of the conclusion of the contract, except where the circumstances show that the buyer did not rely, or that it was unreasonable for him to rely, on the seller's skill and judgment. C. Possess the qualities of goods which the seller has held out to the buyer as a sample or model. D. Are contained or packaged in the manner usual for such goods, or, where there is no such manner, in a manner adequate to preserve and protect the goods. The seller is not liable under above paragraphs AD for any lack of conformity of the goods if at the time of the conclusion of the contract the buyer knew or could not have been unaware of such lack of conformity. There is no obligation on the seller to sell goods in conformity with all the provisions in force in the buyer's state unless The same provisions are applicable in the seller's state. The buyer made the seller aware about the provisions. The seller was aware of the provisions. The seller is liable for any lack of conformity which exists at the time when the risk passes to the buyer, even though the lack of conformity becomes apparent only after that time. The seller is also liable for any lack of conformity which occurs after the time indicated in the preceding paragraph and which is due to a breach of any of his obligations. Thanks for watching.